A warm welcome from my side to the Crypto Startup School. My name is Luca, and I will be the host for the entire week. So, in case you're looking for food, you need anything, you need accommodation, or you need anything else, don't hesitate to ask me or Rami. He's essentially the co-organizer. I'm speaking here today, these welcome words, also on behalf of Philipp Sandner, who unfortunately cannot join us. He will be joining us later for his slot. In that sense, I'm delighted to see a very, not yet enthusiastic, maybe a bit sleepy crowd, but I hope this will change over the course of the week and over the course of the day. I will now basically take a couple of minutes to just talk you through the organizational details, so that you know essentially what you've signed up and what you can expect. So essentially, I'm sure you have all already taken the time to check the website, some probably more regularly than others, but still the website and the schedule on the website, crypto-startup-school.de, is the schedule for the entire week. So if you feel like you can join me in just visiting the site for the moment, you will see all the lectures, all the pauses, essentially all the lunch times and topics that will be taking place during the entire week. The idea is that we're going to start. It's like a bit of a matrix structure, if you want. So we'll start with the basics, the introduction, and maybe an overview, so we all get a bit of a feeling of the ICO market and before the blockchain basics. And then we will progress from Monday to Friday on a more technical level. So that we essentially cover all aspects in terms of marketing, in terms of investor relations, how to handle it. So we basically get a feeling of the entire process of an ICO. If you want to basically build a company and make it ICO ready, or you have an idea, you have a startup, how to do that. And the structure from top to bottom, so from early in the morning until late in the afternoon. We will first be starting with topics that concern blockchain, applications on blockchain, or the ICO market. And then towards the afternoon, in the afternoon sessions, we will focus more on the entrepreneurial side and basically how to build a company, best practices, and then also this will include your teamwork. Because as you are well aware, the idea is that there is a very interactive part to this program, with the idea that you will get together in groups of 3 to 5 people. You will work on an idea over the course of the week in the afternoon sessions. These sessions will be in cooperation with the German Tech Entrepreneurship Center, who are also co-organizers of the event. And then on Friday, there will be essentially a pitch battle as the closing event of this week, where you guys will essentially fight for the prize money. And we will basically then see who's gonna come up with the best ICO idea or ICO pitch. One very important event also for you all, or one very important point on the agenda, are the networking drinks at 4:45. So remember, this is also very much thought as a networking event, so don't hesitate to connect to another, to talk to each other. Every day from 4:45 until 5:15, there will be networking drinks, so beer and finger food provided, so you guys can mingle, and then we will go into the group work. Okay. So in that sense, nice of you guys to drop in. I am really delighted that you are here. Don't get disturbed by the camera. Apparently, we will be recording all the sessions, so if anyone does not feel like being recorded, just raise a hand or leave the room. Welcome. One very organizationally important feature, of course, is the local Wi-Fi. You can connect to it. The Wi-Fi is FS event. The password is willkommen. So you see, we're trying to be very, very welcoming here in this sense. Okay, so unless there are any other question concerning organization, I forgot to mention lunch. Lunch also a very important topic. There will be lunch vouchers, so before leaving for lunch, make sure you ask Rami or myself to get one of those, and then you will basically be entitled to a delicious meal in our canteen. Okay, so without further ado, we shall start with the first point on the menu. Essentially, Veronika, please join me. We will now be giving, or you will now have the pleasure to listen to her and myself for a little longer, because we will be giving you a hands-on blockchain workshop, or the idea of how we basically our take on this topic. So, Veronika, why don't you maybe just give us a couple of words?
Yeah, thanks for now, Luca, for introducing and talking about the most important topic so far. Briefly to myself, I have a background in mathematics, and I was working for some time in the real estate sector, and then just nearly 2 years ago, I stumbled into my first Bitcoin meetup. It was more like by accident, and I was pretty quickly super intrigued by this concept of a global decentralized peer-to-peer cash system, and decided to really dive deeper into the topic. So this is what brought me into an IT consultancy first, and now to the Blockchain Center as research assistant. What about you, Luca? What brought you to blockchain, and what's your path?
Okay. Well, so I will introduce myself a bit in more detail. I am a colleague of Veronika. I work for the Blockchain Center as a research assistant. My background is actually not IT related. It's a classical finance and sort of quantitative methods side. So having spent a couple of years on the trading floor for an investment bank, I then decided to pivot and focus a bit on anything that back in my days used to be called econometrics and now has the fancy name of machine learning and AI. So this is more of my side, and I looked essentially on these parts and the development of quantitative investment strategies, essentially on time series. And then, of course, at some point, with all the hype around blockchain and cryptocurrencies, or the hype around Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, you sort of stumble over that topic. And then once you start looking into crypto, you obviously notice or realize there's more to it than just trading and speculation, but there are actually very good fields of application for the blockchain technology behind it. So that's essentially, and making this connection of analyzing the new data that is available through introducing public ledgers and maybe applying econometric models or quantitative analysis to it. That's essentially what really fascinates me about this topic.
Wow, cool, thank you. We thought it might be nice if every one of you can, we're quite some people, but really, really briefly say a name, maybe whatever you want to add, like your company, what brought you to blockchain, what brought you here, just that we get a little comfortable with each other. We want to start here, maybe? Yes.
Okay, I will talk later. So my name is Andreas, and so then later during the day I will talk about strategy and ICO. Based in Switzerland, running a hedge fund. I will introduce me later a little bit more during my talk. What brought me here? Basically those two guys, and they asked me to give some talk. So about the ICO industry, we are active active trading and investing in ICOs and cryptocurrencies. So, and the rest I will explain later. After you.
My name is Veronika. I'm born in Germany, 64, so I'm 53 years old. I was dealing with all kind of produces and services in entrepreneurship, almost in the east part of Europe. Well, starting with a famous 286 computer and finally dealing with planes, or not the big planes, the ultralight planes. And I'm in a project, well, a concept regarding an art platform. So I know a lot of arts, famous people in arts that are getting very low money. Their average, their wages far under the average, and I try to create a synergy between investors and art people.
That sounds great, yeah.
Technology and, well, of course, crypto currency and smart contracts. So I'm very eager to be here and to get all the information I can.
Great. Thank you.
My name is Claudio. I'm coming from Munich, just arrived this like 10 minutes ago. I'm here with my startup Picta. We're working with the images. So what we do is we streamline the workflows of image producers and image users, and we're currently evaluating and working out how to store copyright, intellectual property in the blockchain, and also license management. Yeah, I'm very eager to find out more from the legal and business perspective. My partner Matthias, he will arrive shortly. He's our CTO, so he will look at the more on the technical side.
Mm-hmm.
So my name is Alfred. I'm from Cologne. I'm a sales manager and fund manager, and I'm just curious.
I'm Ulf from Germany, near Frankfurt. I just want to, I'm very interested in this blockchain and ICO because we have some ideas what we want to push in the market and look for financial.
Hi, my name is Dennis. I'm Senior Key Account Manager to an IT consulting company and co-founder of Blockchain First, a global platform for blockchain professionals. And I'm keen on getting a deep dive into the ICO methodology, legal aspects, and going-to-market strategy.
Perfect.
I'm Leonard. I'm part of the video team here, so not so much into blockchain, but it's not the first blockchain event that we cover, so I'm curious to learn some more.
So it's my turn, right?
Yeah.
I'm Jacob, basically Croatian, but from Cologne. I'm with a fund and asset management company based in Frankfurt, and at the moment developing a structure and trying to get the first product on the exchange, which deals with crypto and ICOs, which is completely regulated. So I'm here to learn more about blockchain in its levels.
My name is Martin Jander. I'm a software developer, and I'm interested in this Bitcoin technology. I mined since some years, in the mining business since some years, and I wanted to create an own ICO. So I'm very familiar with that topic, but I still need some info about the regulatory side. The technical side should be no problem for me, I think. And I'm here with some colleagues with a new idea that could be a startup that's connected to the blockchain technology.
Yeah, my name is Frank. I come close from the area of Dortmund, and I'm sitting here in the middle of my colleagues, and we are looking forward for this week to learn more about ICOs, because ICO is maybe a chance for us to get a financial instrument for our idea, which is also close to the area of blockchain technology. And I think we will hear more about this technology and about our idea, at least on Friday. And yeah, I'm really interested and looking forward to learn more about ICO and parts of blockchain technology.
Hi everybody, I'm Jörg. I'm the third one of this group. I'm an angel investor from Munich, and we have several business ideas in mind. We would like to see a bit more about the ICO technology and how can we get do an ICO to finance our projects in general.
My name is Lorenz Alring. I've been living in Hamburg for the past 6 years and just started working in a startup called Before Chain. Basically, they are helping with ICOs. They're doing the marketing and also helping other startups to be on the blockchain. And you're working with different blockchains together to help other ICOs be successful.
I'm Frank. I run an health insurance comparison platform in Germany. I'm German, but currently I live in Cyprus. And we are here to find out about ICO and maybe developing a holistic health platform.
Yeah, hi, my name is Ben. I'm from Stuttgart. I was working for a bank there 11 years, but last year I quit. And yeah, I met Frank 2 months ago in Bali in a pool. It was really a great day. And, well, yeah, I'm really fascinated by the blockchain and stumbled over Bitcoin, made some trading, some success. As you guys know, 2017 was a great year for everybody who was invested in cryptos. So I was more fascinated even, and yeah, now we're trying to find out what blockchain or how blockchain and ICOs can help us developing this platform.
Hi, I'm Nicholas. I'm a freelance consultant for social impact investment. Actually used to work at the Frankfurt School for 8 years, a long time ago, and helped set up some microfinance funds and other things. And I'm interested in the DLT as an alternative source for funding for small and medium enterprises and startups.
Good morning, my name is Kai. I'm an entrepreneur for the last 15 years. Founded my first company out of Frankfurt University, Kütt University. Right now I have a company based here in Frankfurt called Antelope. It's a company at the intersection between fitness and sports and technology. And we raised around like 5 million in the last years. We have like the classical way, like from business angels over venture capital, family offices. We did a crowdfunding Indiegogo campaign, really successful, raised 1.5 million. In the last round, a huge corporation, and like a strategic investor joined us. And yeah, as everybody who works in startups, we are interested in ICO. It's a huge and really interesting thing. When I heard so I was in the accelerator program of Stanford last year in 2017. Then we went a little bit into that theme, and we were thinking about doing an ICO last year, but then we decided to concentrate on other things. Perhaps it was a wrong decision, but it's never too late, so we will see.
Hätte Fahrradkette.
Not this too?
Yeah.
Okay. So hi, my name is Jun. I come from Berlin, but as you can see, not originally German. I'm Chinese. So I came here for the aim of exploring possible funding opportunities through ICO and also talking to potential investors, because we're trying to start a business that is taking care of children's adaptive learning process. So we want to revamp the education system using AI and to create adaptive learning, individualized learning for children, and also extend to adults, which means that not every kid needs to sit in the classroom with one pace, one teacher, and being discouraged or being bored. So that's one of our products. Another product is try to get parenting more in a positive way, and also child care, like an Uber of child care. So whenever we go, for example, if I come here for this meeting, my child will be safely taken care of by someone which is also located in Frankfurt, not in Berlin. So this kind of certification will need a lot of trust. But where comes the trust? Blockchain may bring some light to that. So that's what our feeling is. The problem we have is usually funding, because wherever you go, technology seems to be so fancy and so much into solving little problem with a little easiness. But education is such a great thing for everybody, for children and adults. But not much actually money coming into it, or people feel guilty to raise money for education. I want to break it through, and I want to see that our technology and money should go more into children's development for a better world. So that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ilya. I live here in Frankfurt. I have a classical banking background, but privately I'm very interested in blockchain and ICOs due to the fact that I've got a couple of ideas. One of them is building a charity platform based on blockchain technology, because the trust is also the issue which can be fixed by blockchain from my point of view. And now I'm just looking for the know-how, how to set it and how to develop it, this idea, and I've got also some other ideas to develop. So I'm privately very interested and hope to learn a lot and to develop my own startup.
I'm Maximilian, and we think about having an index fund on the economy platform, and I would like to learn a little bit more about blockchain and cryptocurrency and ICOs, and I think we can learn something, and I'm curious to meet a lot of people and hear about new ideas, and that's an important part to me.
Thank you.
Hello everybody, I'm Florin. I live in Romania. I'm a Romanian. I run several activities. I have my own firm. We're offering consulting in blockchain, fintech, and crypto investments. I have a team made of former employees of derivatives exchange. The one based in Romania, it was called Cybex, but now it was bought by Luca Stock Exchange. I have a background of about 11 years in financial markets. During the last 2 years, I'm focusing more on blockchain, fintech, and crypto investments. I'm also working with various consulting partners in all major financial centers around the world. And we're also doing some trading, so maybe we can catch up on later stages. I'm here because I want to find out more about blockchain and ICOs, and because I'm also planning to start a platform, an exchange, using some EU grants offered in Romania. Thank you.
Hi, my name is David. I'm working with KeyFind, a consultancy company, and we offer ICO advisory, and basically I'm here to gather knowledge about how we can improve our framework.
Hello, I'm Edison. I'm from the US, recently moved to Prague. I'm a software entrepreneur. I've got a software development agency and also have background in financial markets as well. Recently had a mobile application for stock investments, decided to pivot into cryptocurrency trading, which is currently under development at the moment. And I'd like to explore some additional ideas for potential ICO as well.
Hello, my name is Fabian. I'm from Stuttgart too. I'm a construction engineer, and the moment I'm working at Ziplin, one of the biggest construction companies, in the Department of Business Process Management and Digital Transformation. Therefore, I'm doing my second master degree in Switzerland at a part-time at the moment, and beginning writing my master's thesis in July and August till September about blockchain, ICO for construction, and therefore I'm here.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I think everyone got an impression of who is here now. So what we're aiming at with this tutorial today is that we want to do a like hands-on part in the end, and before we start this week, we want to make sure that everyone has done some transactions on like open blockchain networks. So, but for us to know who is actually invested in cryptocurrencies and therefore made some. Okay, and who has done like, who is holding their private keys to their investments? Oh, whoa. Okay. So I thought there is not much to teach, but no. I think it's very important to hold your private keys. I don't know if you're conscious about, as long as you don't hold the private keys, you're actually not the owner of your funds. It's actually the same as a bank then. Okay, so therefore we just dive into the fundamentals, or have a look at the roadmap first, and
yes, I'll talk you briefly through it. Yes. Yes, slides will be made available. Yes. I mean, in this case, it's a Prezi, so you don't actually have slides that are available or a PDF, but I can send you the link so you can actually go through. Definitely. Yes, so the roadmap, just so you get an impression of what we have planned for these next, now 2.5 hours. We will discuss the fundamental ideas behind blockchain. We will go into depth so that you grasp the main concepts of how hashes, nonces, and so on actually combine together to the proof of work. We will make this a bit interactive, because otherwise just listening to slides is a bit boring. And then we will also touch on the anonymity aspect, because you have a public ledger, as I mentioned. You have data that you can analyze, so we will do that in a live demonstration in R. Then also focus a bit on the Ethereum platform, because that's essentially, as many of you may be aware, that's basically a good idea to have some knowledge on when you're also planning to do an ICO. Then we will move to the transacting part, where you will all, in a test environment, basically create your own wallets, and then we'll be essentially sending test ether to one another, and then also interact with the smart contract. So Veronika, go ahead, please take it from here.
About the Frankfurt School Blockchain Center, I think you wouldn't be here if you wouldn't know about it. So what we're doing is actually like workshops, training. We do research projects. At the moment, we're working on a project, for example, on self-sovereign identity. We're putting like certifications on the blockchain. And self-sovereign identity is a concept where the user itself is in control of its own identity, which is not the case at the moment, for example. So, and we're working together with like banks, and we're working on topics like Industry 4.0, Internet of Things, all that. And you're already at the Crypto Startup School. So what else we have is Certified Blockchain Expert. This is exactly the course where we put the certificates on the blockchain. And so let's get started with the fundamentals. I have a question for you. What problem? I mean, there is super much hype about blockchain, and it's going to change the whole world and so on. I think everyone has heard these like crazy quotes and phrases, but what is actually so groundbreaking about the technology?
Solving a trust issue.
Yeah? Which kind of like...
Also speed, in a general sense.
The speed so far is not that groundbreaking.
For example, smart contracting types.
But what is the trust thing?
Decentralization of this whole system, so that you don't have to put everything into a centralized system.
Yeah.
That there may be manipulation and corruption and things like that.
Yeah. This is
get rid of intermediaries.
also okay. I will help you. Okay. I go back a little bit. So normally we're talking about the internet, yeah. But when we're now in the context of blockchain, we're actually talking about the Internet of Information. Why that? What is happening when I'm sending at the moment a JPEG, for example, to Luca? Yeah, I'm actually not sending him the original, but rather I'm sending him a copy of the JPEG. Yeah, and when it comes to digital values, I actually don't want a copy of that. If I'm sending €1 to Luca, we have to make sure that I don't own the euro at the moment. And the whole concept is called the double spending problem. This is actually what has been solved by Satoshi Nakamoto. It's the problem, how can we make sure that a digital value is not spent twice? And at the moment, this is why we have trusted intermediaries. At the moment, or until Bitcoin was invented, there was no possibility of sending any digital value without having an intermediary in between. We need like PayPal, Visa, MasterCard, or these institutions to have a look on the ledger. So the problem, though, is that they're having their central ledgers. And always when we have central ledgers, and I think we've seen that in the last years a lot, that these ledgers get hacked, data gets stolen, and so this is always, a central ledger is always a single point of failure. And another problem, which is less a problem like in Germany, for example, but in the end, we have very limited access to these systems for some people in the world. There is still, I think, like 2 billion people who don't have any access to a financial system. They don't have a bank account, and therefore their economic activity is like extremely limited. So, and this is when Satoshi Nakamoto, he came up with the concept of Bitcoin. And which is like, in the beginning, it was created as a peer-to-peer digital cash system. At the moment, it's like, we can argue about if this vision is met, because at the moment it's very, very, like we have like 7 transactions per second on the Bitcoin blockchain. It's super volatile, so we cannot really use it as a currency right now. We'll see though, there are some different concepts, like for example, Lightning Network, which are being established, which can maybe help at least to solve the scalability problem. So the thing is, what we realized afterwards is that we had this concept of digital cash, and later we realized that with this whole blockchain thing, we can actually transfer any digital value without having to have an intermediary in between, which means like it's really peer-to-peer. And it took me some time to really grasp that concept. I mean, at the moment, when we do a transaction with a bank, let's say to someone in a foreign country even, the transaction goes through, I don't know how many banks, correspondence banks in between. So, and it takes like, especially if we do transactions into other countries, it costs like 10%, 7 to 10% on average. And it can take up to like, I think 10 working days, which is like a crazy thought when we're like regarding the fact that we're super digital and everything is super fast at the moment. So, I want to just wrap our heads around the basic concepts of this whole Bitcoin thing. So the first thing is the decentralization. And we're actually, it sounds super easy, but we're so used to having these centralized parties. So what does it mean? What makes Bitcoin safe? And you already said that it's the decentralization. What does it mean? I'm sending something, €1, let's say, to Luca again. And it means every single person here in this room is writing down this transaction. Every single person in this room will write down that I gave €1 to Luca. And then Luca is like, oh, no, I never received it. And I'm like, Luca, can you please have a look at all these sheets of paper where it's written down? And Luca would need to compromise at least half of you, or one more than half of you, that to change the data on the sheet. And when we imagine this whole concept, but not people in a room, but nodes, computers, spread all over the world, and it's not like everyone can access, everyone can be a so-called node in the network and secure the network, then it's super difficult to compromise that system. This is one part, what's making it super safe. The next thing is, maybe I didn't, yeah, I just see.
One question. So regarding this, it's very interesting what you just said. Regarding all the people making the notes, right? And then do you actually know who exactly have written the notes? Is it traceable?
You can see who are the nodes, yeah.
Okay. So, because that was also my concern for a little bit, that if someone who's so powerful and so rich and that has also
Exactly.
access to all those people can also kind of manipulate and then transfer the money just to, in case, they want them to change.
I mean, we have at the moment kind of a mining centralization in Bitcoin, yeah, that there are huge mining farms are built and they have a lot of computing power. On the other hand, they'd be stupid to destroy their own system, yeah, kind of, because they actually put some money into it. The next, yeah.
Like they were, because they're so powerful, they were not manipulate the system.
Yeah, I mean, they put a lot of money into it, and the miners, when they have a huge mining pool, if they compromise Bitcoin, they get some money out of it, but then the system would be like going down because there is no trust anymore, and they have the huge mining farms, and so, but they're working on this issue.
Theoretically, it's possible that people compromise the system.
At the moment with Bitcoin, theoretically, yes, but practically it's pretty much, it's impossible. Actually, Bitcoin is the only system, IT system in the world so far that has never been hacked. It's the only system in 9 years there hasn't been any hack at all. If there are hacks, it's centralized exchanges. Yeah. The next concept, which is super important, is the concept of the consensus mechanism. So you're wondering, how can we make sure if everyone is just scribbling down some data on a piece of paper, or let's say in a database, how do we have the same data? And this is just it's not really readable, sorry for that. So it's about how do we make sure everyone is writing down the same data. And then we're coming to this whole proof of work thing and the economic incentives. So the next question is, why should you people write down that I give €1 to Luca? You normally wouldn't care about what we do. But if we give some economic incentives for writing down that data, then you might participate in the system and secure the network. Yeah. And then we're actually coming to like some, hashes, blocks, proof of work, the technical basics.
Yes, thank you, Veronika. So this was essentially the broad idea of the blockchain and how it essentially evolved. Now I am going to talk you a bit through the more technical aspects that are that basically are prerequisites to it. So we'll look into hashes, blocks, nonces, and of course see how this all plays together in a proof of work consensus. Now, here is essentially the more interactive part, so to say. We will go through this together. Now, the first part that is very important to understand, what is a hash function? Can anybody tell me what a hash function is? Nobody. I thought you all are invested. Okay, a hash function is basically just an encryption algorithm, okay? It is a function that performs mathematical operations based on an input or n inputs, and it gives an output. There are different kinds of hashing algorithms. This one that I'm using is the SHA-256. It's actually the one that is used by Bitcoin, more or less. Fun fact, it was developed by the NSA in 2001. And it can now basically be used by anyone with a public license, essentially. So why 256? Well, it's the output of basically of the string in bits. And what does SHA stand for? Anybody want to take a wild guess? It stands for secure hashing algorithm. So, you know, very creative on the part of the name giving. Anyways, so what does this thing do? Well, down there you see basically the hash of nothing. So it's a very long character string, and once I start typing, you know, it calculates here basically the hash of whatever input I give this function on the fly. So you see down here the hash of hello is, you know, some gibberish essentially. But what is very important, this hash function, it has several cool properties. Okay, so the hash function, first of all, is always the same, yields always the same result for the same input. So no matter how often I type hello, okay, it's always going to come out with the same hash. Now, if you had a very good photographic memory, you would be able to see this. We will see that later, okay? So basically, the same input yields the same output. Another very cool property is once I modify any input to the function just a tiny bit, the entire output of the function is going to be something completely different. Okay, so if I type in hello, you see the hash. But if I add just one space, it's something completely different. Okay, which makes it very, very hard to guess, let's say impossible to guess, what the actual input was for a given output. So, in other words, when I see the output of a hash function, I have no idea of knowing the inputs. Okay, so that's why it's sometimes also referred to or called a mathematical trapdoor, because I can only go one way, basically. Okay, so that is essentially what a hash function is. Why do I tell you this? Well, because, you know, when I go one step further, I can add several sort of arguments to a hash function. So let's say I have a block of data. I have a block number. I have a random number that is for the moment just called a nonce, and I have my data field. Okay, then I do a hash of all these input arguments, and then you see the hash is something like down there. So why is this hash really cool? Well, once I have calculated the hash of this data, and I send the data to someone else, and I tell him the hash function or the hash value that I calculated, well, he can very easily check if the data has been compromised or if it's actually really the same input or the same data that I'm talking about. So you see, if I just add a space here, the hash, as in the previous example, it changes completely, and well, because it's obviously a very nice graphical interface, the whole block changes or turns red, meaning that you know, the hash value does not match the one that was calculated before. Okay. So this is essentially the first type of property or type of application that I have for the hash function. I have sort of a unique identifier for a specific data set or data inputs that I give it, and I can very easily check if anything, even a tiny bit, has been changed or modified. So is the hash actually readable even from the back? Okay. Do you guys notice anything about this hash that is different from the other ones that you've seen so far? Yes, perfect. It starts with 4 zeros. Now the question is, why does it start with four zeros? Anybody want to take a guess? Yes, we're getting there, exactly. Because a hash function that starts with many leading zeros, in this case it's 4. If you take, for instance, the case of Bitcoin, okay, it's 18 leading zeros. These hashes with many leading zeros, they're very rare to find. So what do? I have a specific type of data. Let's say, for instance, hello, okay? I want to write this in a block, and I want to get a hash, just because it's convention, with many leading zeros. What do? Well, I can basically just go ahead and change the nonce, which is just a random number I add to a given data set, okay? Just a random number, I type 1. I look at the hash, Okay, it doesn't start with four leading zeros. Okay, that's a bummer. Let's try 2. Okay, still doesn't start with leading zeros. It's very hard to find these hashes. Okay, but I can sort of automate the process, which is exactly what this little mine button does. Okay, and it sort of solves and tries many hashes, it computes many hashes. And what you see is that the nonce changed, okay? And this nonce makes the entire, basically, hash value of the block that contains the data, hello, check out to 4 leading zeros, okay? So this process of trying or of constantly calculating many hash values until I get a specific number of leading zeros in my hash, that is the proof of work. That is essentially called of mining. And I mean, I have to put in a certain calculation work until I find basically the hash value that I want. Okay, so that is why it's called essentially a proof of work. Okay, this is what miners do. That's why it's obviously also so calculation intensive and energy consuming. Okay, so we've talked about hashes and blocks. What about the chain? Okay, so what's different in this case than compared to just a single block? Okay, who can tell me the difference? What's new? We already had the block number before. Okay, anybody guess? No? Okay. Let's say, yes, exactly, there's a previous hash. Okay, why is there a previous hash? Okay. Yes, exactly. So for instance, if I have some data and I want to have it in a sort of, let's say, chronological order, then just by including the hash of the previous block into the new block, basically enables me to chain one block of data to another until I get a ledger that is tamper-proof. Because I already told you, if I just change a very tiny bit in any data point, in any of the chains, the hash will completely change, okay? So if I change, for instance, if I add a space here in the penultimate data block, then the hash of the block, it doesn't check out. It won't have 4 leading zeros, okay? Unless I'm very, very lucky, which is extremely improbable. So it doesn't have 4 leading zeros, and so if I wanted to make it correspond to what I sort of expect, if I wanted to give it a hash with 4 leading zeros, I would have to remine it, okay? And then, of course, the last block, to confirm the previous block, because the hash value of block number 4, it changed once I mined it. So it would also change, or the input to the next block, it would also change, okay? Because the hash of the previous block is different from what it was before. So I would also have to go through the process of finding appropriate hash values, so a lot of trial and error. Essentially, this property just means that the further I go back in the past, okay, so if I, for instance, wanted to change something in block number 1 and add hello here, okay, this would invalidate the entire chain afterwards. And I would go, basically, I would have to recalculate the entire history of the entire blockchain, okay, if I wanted to amend something. So basically, entries in the past in a blockchain, they are very, very secure and almost immutable. Well, they are immutable if you want, okay. So this is essentially just a chain of blocks. Now we still have the problem that Veronika mentioned. Now I have my nice little blockchain. I can calculate basically hashes and make it come out, so I can play around with it. I can create it however I want. So the question is, how do we now prevent this thing from being tamper-proof, okay? Because now I could just, create my history as I wanted, then show it to someone and say, it's a blockchain, it's immutable, so it's got to be true, right? Well, the very easy question is decentralization, okay? It just means I give a copy to everyone, okay? Everybody has the same thing. Everybody has the same blockchain. And if now, for some reason, peer A decided to play around with the data and say, okay, block 4, it contains the value hello. And if you were even that clever to mine it and then say, okay, look, my version of the blockchain, it checks out. The penultimate block, it contains hello. Well, then the other peers in the network, who also hold a copy of the blockchain, they could just very easily check the hashes, okay, the hash values, and then say, my version of the blockchain, it doesn't match. It doesn't match yours. So there's got to be some difference. Even maybe if I don't exactly know where the difference is or what has changed, I just know something has been tampered with. And then it's very simply a democratic principle, okay? Maybe peer B and C, they talk to each other and they compared their hashes. And then they basically realize, okay, maybe maybe peer A, he has modified something, because the beauty is the entire history of the data of the blockchain, it's basically included in one hash value, okay? So it's very easy to check and verify who has sort of the right copy, and then I have a democratic principle, and I can basically decide which version is correct. So unless I have a very clever way of bribing more than half the network, you know, I cannot exactly just make up my own past. So let's take this one step further, because so far we have just typed in a bit of nonsense and random data points. But you know, if we now include transactions, all of a sudden you can see how this whole concept makes sense. Okay, so now we could, for instance, say, okay, Darcy, she sent $25 to Bingley and so forth. So we include a couple of transactions in a block, and we include or we basically create a history of the blocks by just chaining one block to another, and we distribute a copy of this ledger to any peer. Anybody can verify if this transaction history essentially is correct. Okay, and even if here, for instance, a value changes just by 1 cent, you know, as you would expect, the entire hash value would change, and everybody can check whether his copy matches or is correct one, or the values that he's presented with have been tampered with or not. Okay. Does anybody spot any missing piece so far, which we haven't talked about yet, when you look at this basically this very simple first decentralized ledger that we have established? What's missing? Have you been to one of my workshops before? It's exactly right. Okay, it's exactly right. Obviously, there needs to be a coin-based transaction that defines which user or which participant in the transaction has actually what number of coins. Okay, because so far there was no such transaction. So now at the moment we have a very first transaction. Let's call it the coin-based transaction. Okay, it defines in total that's going to be $100. We have the creator, for instance, Anders, or in Bitcoin it was Satoshi. Okay, and then he starts distributing the first funds to the network, and then you can take it from there. Which also means that at any point you can verify if a user that, you know, or it can be verified that any user who you're transacting with has sufficient funds to actually do the transaction. So this is essentially the concept, and these are the sort of aspects that make all the puzzles of nonsense, proof of work, and hashes fit together to this decentralized ledger that we call a blockchain. Okay, so now that you actually can be or are persuaded that I didn't just make up an example, Veronika will actually take you through the real life Bitcoin blockchain so that you see how these principles, or that you will be able to see that all these principles you will also find in the real thing, in the real Bitcoin blockchain.
Mm-hmm. Who has had a look at the Bitcoin blockchain so far? Ever? Okay, yeah. So it's like from investing to owning their own funds to having a look at the blockchain. Getting less. Okay, so we just want to have, because there is very often this saying that Bitcoin is anonymous. Luca will even prove that this is not too much the case. And yeah, the blockchain it's absolutely transparent. So you can see all transactions that are made on the blockchain. So you just go to blockchain.info, which is like the information about the Bitcoin blockchain. And what you can see here is actually the so-called height of the block, which is just the number of the block. And you can see that there is 5 blocks missing. That's kind of weird. Okay, it should be just increasing numbers. I cannot explain that right now. Okay, so this is actually the number of the block. And you can see how many, when the block was mined. So on Bitcoin, it's on average every 10 minutes. And how many transactions were included in the block, how many Bitcoins were sent, and who mined the block. If it's a mining pool or maybe a smaller user who is unknown. And then you can also see how big, at the moment, the block size limit is 1 megabyte in Bitcoin. So you can see this is all below the limit. And there is a so-called weight, because last year in August, there has been SegWit has been activated. Oh no, actually a little bit later, which just means that you segregate, SegWit just stands for segregated witness. So you segregate some data from the transactions themselves. So if you have normal transactions, the maximum size is 1 megabyte of a block. But if you have SegWit transactions, which are smaller in size, you can actually put like 4 megabytes into the block, which is the so-called weight. And what you can also see, like when we click on a block, like we saw before, the number of transactions, we have the transaction volume and the timestamp. We can see the nonce, which is like Luca explained, the number which has to be found in the proof of work mechanism to find a hash, a digital fingerprint of the block, which fulfills certain criteria. And the criteria is actually the so-called difficulty in Bitcoin. Yeah? The difficulty always gets adjusted. So at the moment, you have to find a hash with like 18 leading zeros. But if there is too much hashing power in the system, the difficulty gets adjusted. So for example, it gets, suddenly you have to find like 19 leading zeros to fulfill the criteria of the hash. And you can also see like the so-called Merkle root of the transactions. So what is happening that because the transactions themselves, they would use too much data, too much size in the block. So they just hash one transaction, they hash another transaction. We have the digital fingerprints, the hashes of these 2 transactions, and these 2 hashes, they get hashed again. And this is what we do with all the transactions. And then we have a kind of a tree. And at the very, very top, we only have 1 fingerprint, 1 hash of all the transactions. If we changed 1 transaction slightly, we'd have a totally different root. Luca showed that if we change data slightly, the fingerprint, the hash, changes completely. So this is the so-called Merkle root, which is included also in the block. Yeah, and you see the hash of the previous block. Yeah, so that this is like unchangeably linked to each other. And then we can see the transactions of which are included in every block. So for example, let's say I'm buying, again, we do a transaction, and I'm like, hey, Luca, I want to buy a bicycle of you. Can you please send me your Bitcoin address? And the Bitcoin address is kind of like the bank account number at the moment. The difference is when Luca is giving me his normal bank account number, I can send money to that bank account number, but I cannot see how many funds he has on his bank account. In Bitcoin, it's different. If he just sends me the Bitcoin address where he stores his funds, I can just check his address, and I'm like, this is Luca's address. Let's have a look. Okay, he already did like 1,034 transactions. He totally received 2 Bitcoins, and at the moment he has 0.9 Bitcoins. Everything is visible. What he should do if I want to send him some money, he should create a new Bitcoin address, which is like empty. Or if he doesn't mind me knowing how much money he has, he can also send me the address where he stores all his funds. Yeah, so everything is totally visible. And this is why we have full transparency, and we have this pseudonymity, which Luca is talking about, but it's not anonymous. Yeah, because as soon as we have one link, and I know, for example, the address of Luca, and I also know that he did a transaction with someone else last week, and I kind of know the amount, I can just have a look at the transactions, and then I also know the address of the other person. Yeah, and this is what Luca will show in the demonstration. So I'm not too familiar with this one. Does anyone have an idea? So we have here something like no inputs, and we have this 12.54 Bitcoin here. What could that be? Anyone has a clue? Exactly. So like we said, there are economic incentives for the mining process itself. So whoever finds the nonce, this number, which fulfills, together with the transactions, with the things included in the block, which fulfills the criteria to have a certain output hash. Yeah? Whoever finds that nonce first gets rewarded with, at the moment, 12.5 Bitcoin. This amount, and at the moment we're around $6,000, a little bit lower, so it's like $70,000 on average for every block mined. Every 10 minutes, 12.5 Bitcoins get distributed to the network. And this amount halves every 4 years on average. The next halving is like in 2 years. So, and these 12.5 Bitcoins is the reward for the block, plus the transaction fees. And this goes to the miner. Yeah, so you have a brief idea, a rough idea on how this works and on a anonymity or not so anonymous state of Bitcoin. And we're gonna have a look at an analysis now.
So thank you. This is basically the first intuition that we have on transactions on the Bitcoin blockchain. Please note this is quite specific to Bitcoin or Ethereum. What we'll now do is basically have a short discussion on how anonymous Bitcoin really is. Because we have the perfect ledger, which is transparent. Of course, we don't have any real-world identities that we see that are, that are displayed. But essentially, we still see their public key hashes. So at some point, you might ask yourself, if I transact in Bitcoin, how anonymous really am I? And Veronika mentioned it. Bitcoin is not anonymous, even not in the sense of the definition of the word. Because for something to be anonymous, you need to have two conditions. You need to have pseudonymity, this weird thing that's called pseudonymity. So everybody does not transact or appear in his real world or with his real world identity, but under a pseudonym, a bit like a writer, and unlinkability. And the combination of these two, that only gives me full anonymity. And this, even by the definition of the word, is not the case in Bitcoin. Okay, so Bitcoin is pseudonymous. So we'll talk about that later, but typically, I mean, most of you, since you're invested, you have gone through, funny enough, an intermediary. So we have a decentralized sort of ecosystem, but you still need intermediaries to enter it. That intermediary, typically, they hold information that link your real world identity to some form of public key. Okay, so if you think about it, then it's very similar to essentially just a bank account or a bank where you identify yourself, and there is a real world identity. There's a connection that can be established between your identity and bank account number. Only here in this case, everybody sees your bank account number or your public key, so it's probably a lot less anonymous. Or transacting in Bitcoin is a lot less anonymous, even than using cash, for instance. Okay, so if we just go into these transaction subtleties to mention some of the points or the aspects why or in what way basically this ledger or info on the ledger can be exploited to reveal some info. Let's go back to the example of Veronika and myself transacting, myself being bold in this example. I don't know why. And let's for instance say, okay, I'm half Italian as the name suggests, so obviously she would buy pizza from me. So let's just assume for the second that we do this transaction, okay? As you've seen on the ledger, you have some input address and output addresses. So already the first type of information that I can use if I really wanted to de-anonymize someone behind some public key addresses, or at least attempt it, if I have more or several input addresses to a transaction, these essentially are proof of control, of joint control of these addresses. Okay, maybe Veronika doesn't have enough funds in one address, in one wallet, but she uses a wallet software that sort of combines funds from several addresses. Then that proves to me that she does not only own one address, but several. Okay, so what I can then gather as information is sort of an address cluster. Okay, and I can process that further for analysis. Another thing, obviously, is the output. Okay, the best practice in Bitcoin, in order to protect sort of your anonymity, is to create a sort of a change address. So whenever you do something, whenever you purchase something on the network with Bitcoin, the idea is to not only to transfer the funds, obviously, or part of the funds to the output address, okay, to the seller, but then also to maybe also create several new, at least one new wallet address, which contains the change of the transaction. So that if a third party just looks on the ledger, they cannot really be sure of, which wallet address actually belongs to Veronika or not. Okay. Of course, if I do this over time and Veronika regularly interacts with several addresses or several participants in the network of whom I know the address clusters, then of course this is also quite tricky, because then at some point, due to spending patterns and regular interaction with other participants, that also may reveal some information. So I can get a good, at least can make a very good guess of tagging some new addresses of her, so that I can get over time a better sort of idea who actually is behind the address. And then of course, numerical precision. It's similar to the intuition that we saw with the freshly mined coins in the example. Okay, we know, for instance, the block reward is 12.5 bitcoins. It's not 11.49 whatever. So whenever I see numerical precision, I can also try to guess or use this information with other information that's not on the blockchain, with real world information, to basically uncover an identity. Just a quick word on the techniques that can be implied or that can be applied. The first one is transaction graph analysis. It's this exact analysis of spending patterns that I've talked about over time, because the beauty of the blockchain from the analysis perspective is I have a ledger, and it's an append-only ledger. Okay, so over time, I just get more and more information, which can be more and more revealing if the transacting party is a bit careless, if you want. Okay, I can also, as I mentioned, due to the fact that the typical entry point into the Bitcoin ecosystem is through intermediaries. So if I am, for instance, an official entity, I can get a subpoena for a criminal investigation or whatever, and then I can directly go or target the intermediaries to get basically the real world identity, or the match between real world identity to some public key address. I can also choose to hack the intermediary, which happens quite regularly, which is something that most of us wouldn't, for instance, do. But it's also a way to establish the link. And then a third one, which I find kind of cool, because so far we have focused on the application layer, so the blockchain layer only. But we also have to think about the fact that essentially the Bitcoin network. It's also a peer-to-peer network, and the nodes, they communicate with each other, okay? Because the information on the transaction, it needs to be disseminated through the network to be validated by the miners. So if all of a sudden you have a couple of nodes that decide to collude with one another to figure out where a transaction came from, okay, which node essentially broadcast a transaction first, well, then I have a very high probability that the node or the guy using the node who basically broadcast the transaction first is also the person or the IP address in the worst case that actually transacted the funds, okay? So that is also a one way that could be used or targeted in order to uncover a real world identity. So we have had the sort of the theory. Now, this is basically an example. This is statistical software. It's open source. It's R. For those of you who are interested, I can share the code. It's not a biggie. So what we've done here is basically, I have collected a series of wallet addresses, and I'm going to show you just how easy it is, basically gathering the information from the transaction. Okay. The first sort of example is WikiLeaks. No, not WikiLeaks. That's going to be the second. Sorry, is WannaCry. Also starts with a W. I got confused. WannaCry. Has anybody heard of the WannaCry hack? Nope. Nope. Okay. It was essentially in a couple of years back, a group of hackers, they decided to target several large companies. And what happened is they basically hijacked a number of computers, of terminals, of servers, and they encrypted the data. And what you then would see is a flashing red screen, essentially, that would tell you, okay, your data has been encrypted. If you want it back, please send your Bitcoins to this and this address. Okay, it was very funny because Deutsche Bahn was one of the victims of the hack, essentially, and all over the Republic of Germany you would see sometimes on some terminals, the thing flashing red, and you would know, okay, this thing was hacked. Anyway, so they used in total three Bitcoin addresses. I collected the 3, and so we can now have a look at what the transactions actually look like. Okay, it's now basically gathering the information, and it's very easy. Through iteration, through an iterative process, you can basically collect all the information of transactions going in and out. Okay, so I'm a bit immobilized with my mic, but the red dot is basically the target wallet address, or the one that the guys from the WannaCry hack disclosed. This was basically the address people were asked to send the funds to. And then you see on the top right, you see the cluster. Okay, a cluster of nodes or a cluster of basically addresses, and they all basically send funds one way. Okay, to the red dot. So you can very easily imagine that this is probably the people that got hacked and wanted to get their data back. And they decided, okay, before it's lost in entirety forever, I might as well just, transfer a couple of Bitcoins in order to get the funds back. And then obviously, if you're a good hacker and want to remain anonymous, but at the same time try to check out, you see what happens basically around the red dot on the top and the bottom, because they were very well aware that funds can be sort of traced quite easily. You try to do as many transactions as possible, like left pocket, right pocket. You create a couple of new addresses, you send around the funds, you send around the change, so it becomes very, very hard to actually trace where the money went, because at some point obviously you want to check out, because otherwise there's no point in doing a hack, right? Any questions so far? Yes.
But isn't it possible to go really to the end? I mean, that's what you normally do with money laundering. When people know money laundering across the globe, you can trace it. It's just a question of time.
Yes. it's true. It's a valid point. There are such things as mixing services. So actually, providers that mix several input transactions, and they create many left pocket, right pocket transactions. They mingle the funds from other addresses to make it really almost impossible to trace the money. Yes, plus you cannot be entirely sure, if you think about it, if someone just doesn't go store some funds in a specific address on for instance, a USB key, and just sells the USB key through cash. Okay, so in the end, you cannot be exactly or 100% sure whether the guy who basically you trace the money with is actually the target person. Yeah.
Is it possible to also see the IP addresses?
The IP addresses, that will be if I figure out, if I collude with a couple of nodes and then try to figure out which node broadcast the transaction first. I'm not exactly sure how easy that is to do. Okay, to me it's more a theoretical aspect. But yeah. Okay. So from the sense of or from the point of anonymity, okay, there is also the second point, or the second example of WikiLeaks. Okay, it's calculating. Of course, you can donate to WikiLeaks. You see, but then again, of course, not only because WikiLeaks is politically, a bit controversial, but also in general, when you have some form of charitable foundation or any endowment where, for instance, the donor wants to remain anonymous, it would at least not be the best intuition to do the donation in Bitcoin, or at least you would have to take several precautionary measures in order to really protect the identity of the person. Okay, so this is the example of WikiLeaks. It looks very different from the first one, and now to basically to make this a bit more interactive or fun for you, I will show you a third example, a picture, and you can then tell me what your interpretation is. Anybody want to take a guess? No? Anything? Okay, this is the cold wallet of Bitfinex, the red dot. Bitfinex is one of the largest exchanges, and what exchanges typically do, they have the largest part of their funds stored in a wallet that is not connected to the internet. Okay, typically some server in some nuclear bunker or whatever, so that it's hidden away and cannot be accessed. Now, of course, because exchanges, they also have many users that like you, that want to transact regularly, so they obviously have to keep part of the funds essentially in a hot wallet, if you want. Okay, so you have the red dot in the middle, and they regularly transfer, also overnight, they transfer funds in and out from the cold wallet to the hot wallet in order to have enough funds to be able to do all the matchmaking and enable transactions. But you essentially see here the cloud of users sort of regularly interacting with the red dot, and you see the hot wallet basically right next to the red dot. I'm going to move the cursor there. This one, okay. And then, of course, you have a couple of other transactions. Okay, a couple of weeks ago, it was basically just one big cloud. But exchanges, they also regularly check their wallets or create new wallets to check for hacks. So that's why you see a couple of transactions left and right, and these other clusters. They have basically been added. It's just recent activity. Okay, so unless there are any questions or comments, I would suggest we take 15, digest all the information, enjoy a bit of coffee, maybe have some croissants. And then also I would like to ask you, in the meantime, to download the MetaMask extension for your Chrome browser. Hang on. That would be this one.